My name is Friar Jude Winkler, and I'm a scripture scholar, and this is the first of a series that I'll be doing for the Companions of St. Anthony on the Psalms. The hope is that eventually we'll have a series of 151 of these videos covering each of the Psalms individually. And this first video is sort of an introduction, just to give us a sense of what the Psalms are all about. There are 150 Psalms contained in our Bible, and they were used by the Jewish people and then later by the church for the past 3,000 years to speak about the people's experience with God, their experience with each other, their call to faithfulness, their emotions during difficult times, their emotions during joyful times. So the Psalms touch a lot of our life experiences. Now, they were all written in Hebrew, and that's a very difficult language to translate into English because it has a different way of presenting time, a different way of presenting connections between words. And these are all poetry. Poetry is always difficult to translate from one language to another. We can't really translate the rhyme, the rhythm, the alliterations. But there is one thing in the Psalms that we can see over and over again, and it's called parallelism. Parallelism is saying the same thing 2 or 3 times with slightly different words to give it an emphasis. Now, sometimes the second time reinforces the first time, sometimes it contradicts the first time, sometimes it expands it. So we're going to have to keep our eye on the idea of parallelism all throughout our study of these Psalms. Now, I mentioned there are 150 Psalms in the Catholic canon. It's also true of the Protestant canon and the Jewish canon, but it's not true of the Orthodox Christian canon. They have a 151st Psalm that is included. Furthermore, there were Psalms found at places like Qumran in the caves that are not included in our Bible. The 150 Psalms we have here are those which have been accepted by the Jews, Protestants, and Catholics throughout the ages. And they're divided into 5 basic books. They're divided into Psalm 3 to 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, and 107 to 150. Now, that division is not hard set because it seems as if they were divided later on for use in the liturgy. So we can't really say that Psalm 43 was written before Psalm 90. That's not always true. But what we can say is that those divisions have a basic theme that we can sort of discern as we study these Psalms. Now, if you noticed, when I said the first book of Psalms, I said from Psalm 3 to 41. We're going to look at Psalms 1 and 2, which are actually a type of introduction to the book of Psalms. Now, a couple things to take into account when I talk about these Psalms. First of all, the numbering of the Psalms. When we look at Psalm 23, at times it's not called 23 in other versions of the Bible. Why? Because some of the versions of the Bible translate the Psalms directly from the Hebrew, where others translate it from the Greek or the Latin. When they translated the original Hebrew into Greek, they combined some Psalms, they divided others, so the numbers can be off by 1 or 2 when we look at the Psalms. That's why it's always good when we want to refer to a particular Psalm to say Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. That way we can identify it better, making sure that we're not confused which Psalm it refers to. The other thing is the number of the verses. Many of these Psalms have introductions, little notes about how it's to be sung. In some translations, those introductions begin the numbering of the verses. In other translations, the numbering of the verses begins with the body of the Psalm. So at times the numbers for verses might be off by 1 or 2. We have to be careful about that. Who wrote these Psalms? Well, many of them are attributed to David and then some other figures of the Old Testament times. The difficulty is that the preposition used to refer things to David is a letter called Lamed in Hebrew. And Lamed could be translated either to or dedicated by. Is it dedicated to him or dedicated by him? In other words, did they write this psalm thinking of David, or did David actually write it? And the more we study these psalms, the more we realize that David might have written a few of them, but probably not all that many. Many of them were dedicated to him. Why? Because he was a famous king, because he was known as a poet and musician, and also as a shepherd. So we have to be a little bit careful about those introductions. Furthermore, we have introductions about how these were to be sung. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of the details on what those introductions actually mean. So we're not sure exactly what those particular words mean. Now, one of the words that we find in the body of the Psalms is Selah, S-E-L-A-H. Whenever you see that word, it simply means take a breath. While they were singing it, it was a pause. Nothing more important about that. And then in other Psalms, you'll see an introduction to a paragraph or a couple of verses. And the introduction begins with the letter Aleph. Aleph is a Hebrew letter. And when they put the Aleph on top of those verses, it means that in Hebrew, each of those verses began with Aleph. They were literary alphabetic psalms, and it was simply a mnemonic device that made it easier to study those psalms. It's not that important for us today, but just so that you know what it means when you see those particular words. What is the most important thing to know about the Psalms? They're prayers. They were intended to help us in our relationship to God. Granted, we can all talk to God using our own words, but isn't it nice once in a while to use words that have been used across 3,000 years and across the world? To know that a faith community is using the same words over and over and over again, raising a joint prayer to the Lord. That is a gift that has been given to us in our Bible. And that's why it's so important to study these Psalms so that we can pray them better, more meaningful to our everyday life.